What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new miniseries Dracula, which dropped today on Netflix, but which aired over the last few days in the UK. I'll keep my comments spoiler-free initially, in case you're debating whether or not to watch it, and I'll give you a nice big fat juicy warning before I discuss any essential details. So let's start with the overview. The show is comprised of 3 90-minute episodes, almost like 3 separate feature films, written by Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, 2 writers most famous for their work on Doctor Who and Sherlock. While readers of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel will find many ingredients, characters, and scenarios that feel really familiar, as you watch the show, it quickly becomes clear that this is practically a page-one rewrite of the story of Dracula, an updating of the material rather than a faithful adaptation. As fans of the novel can attest, there's never really been a truly faithful adaptation of the book, so this revisionist approach should come as no surprise to anyone. The original book, famously described by Clive Barker as a first-rate trashy novel, one that I love dearly and I've read twice. It's tricky to adapt because it unfolds as a series of letters and diary entries and audio recordings by the central characters, allowing the reader to piece together the story over the course of the read. It's an ideal format for audio fiction, podcasts, etc., but most movies tend to take many liberties with the material, even the early films, which have far more in common with the theatrical stage production than Bram Stoker's novel. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the classics like Nosferatu, which is almost 100 years old at this point. And of course, I'm a massive fan of the Dracula films starring Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee. I'm always game for any adaptation, particularly unconventional ones, like the collaboration between Werner Herzog and Klaus Kinski. And while Francis Ford Coppola's film was called Bram Stoker's Dracula, and does successfully adapt quite a bit of the book, it's still a major departure from the book in a lot of crucial ways. I've long since resigned myself to the fact that if I want the true Dracula experience, I should just reread the book, an attitude I would encourage everyone to have before watching this show, one that has a very modern sensibility and a lot of kick. And I'm sure the massive departures from the original narrative are going to excite plenty of debate, which of course in this day and age means a lot of people screaming at each other online about whether the show is inventive or infuriating. But with that in mind, die-hard Dracula fans are going to find plenty of gruesome twists and turns with which they're going to be utterly delighted. All horror fans are pretty familiar with gore, but I was most impressed by the really specific new types of horrific effects featured in this show. The creativity on that front is probably the greatest asset of the show. But in terms of my overall impression of the entire miniseries, let me put it this way. I was enthralled by the first episode and got completely on board. Then I enjoyed the second episode, although not nearly as much as the first. And then sadly, I was a little indifferent to the third episode, not due to the creative liberties, but due to an unsatisfying emotional climax, which I'll get into with my spoilers. As far as the titular character is concerned, I did come to love and adore Claes Bang's interpretation of the character. I hope I'm saying the actor's name correctly. But I'll admit, it took me until I was about halfway through the first episode before I really started to embrace him. There's a devilish charm and playfulness to his approach that I found incredibly refreshing, although I'll totally understand if many viewers find his lighthearted handling of the character to be an obstacle to getting emotionally invested in the story. Lines like, "I'm undead, not unreasonable," tell us everything we need to know about the new direction of the character. The show also reinterprets nearly everything we know about vampire lore, from their special abilities to their thirst for blood, and of course their fatal weaknesses. A lot of people are going to find these changes to be heresy, but for the first time in a long time, it was nice to actually be surprised by the abilities of a vampire while watching a show or movie. Most of these new manifestations of his abilities feel like really gory, creative new directions for the classic powers instead of a complete reinvention. But when it comes to the rest of the cast, I can't say much without running the risk of spoiling this show's endless series of surprises. But suffice to say that all the classic characters like Jonathan Harker, Mina Murray, Dr. Van Helsing, Renfield, Lucy Westenra, Quincy, etc., they're all here, but they've been almost completely reimagined. So most likely a lot of purists are going to kick and scream, but the novel will always be there to enjoy, a book I strongly recommend that every horror fan read. But while I'm not necessarily going to have a temper tantrum about all the changes to the text, there's plenty to critique about the show, in particular the third episode, so I think I need to go ahead and start discussing spoilers. If you want to go into this show completely fresh, now's the time to skip out. Because I had a distinctly different reaction to each episode, I'm going to tackle them one at a time. But what's interesting is how each episode tackles a major key event from the plot of the book. The first episode focuses primarily on Jonathan Harker's experiences at Count Dracula's home. Episode 2 is all about the ill-fated voyage of the Demeter, perhaps my favorite chapter from the original text. And the final episode explores the seduction of Lucy Westenra and her transformation into the infamous Bloofer Lady. From a certain point of view, you could argue that in broad strokes, that sounds like a pretty faithful handling of the material, but the devil's in the details, as you shall soon see. Episode 1 was called The Rules of the Beast, and I was pretty much in awe of it. The episode takes place in Hungary in 1897 and uses an interesting framing device where Jonathan Harker is recovering in a convent after escaping from Dracula's castle, and he's sharing his experiences with a nun named Agatha, who turns out to be Van Helsing. If that kind of gender bending alarms you, I assure you that specific change pales in comparison to the changes to come in episode 3. But I knew we were off to a strong start when I started screaming in horror and laughter within the first few minutes. Harker's looking particularly rough. His hair's falling out, his fingernails are gone, and he's covered in these oozing sores. And then we watch as a fly lands on the surface of his eye and crawls right under the eyelid without us even noticing. The moment was absolutely deliciously disgusting, one of many this episode. The constant presence of flies around the undead and their victims is one of the best recurring details, something that I can't remember seeing in any previous adaptation, but it totally makes sense in that where there is flesh, in particular rotting flesh, you will always find flies. Plus, they give something for Renfield to eat in episode 3. What's fun about this episode is the contrast between the unimaginable horrors found within Dracula's home and the comically direct way of speaking by Van Helsing as she breaks up the narrative with questions like whether or not Harker had any sexual intercourse with the Count. Harker's experiences within the castle are just jaw-dropping. The castle is absolutely beautiful from the exterior, surrounded by all these gorgeous mountains, but inside it's just a tomb of horrors. He finds a room filled with crates containing mindless undead that are trapped within like contortionists as they're trying to break out. And then he finds another room where vampires are living off rats and the occasional infant, one of whom gets transformed into a vampire as well. These scenes feel the truest to the source material, but they also feel very fresh and very new. But the first major revelation that this show is going to go in a completely different direction is when we learn that Harker's already undead. Dracula snapped his neck, but never bothered to turn him all the way into a vampire. He escaped by accident by falling off the top of the castle when his crucifix reflected the sun's light directly into the Count. And during Harker's conversations with Van Helsing, she keeps a bag of wooden stakes on hand with the implied threat very clear that if Harker proves dangerous, he's going down. We also learn that Van Helsing's fellow nun is Mina in disguise, who's come to be with her fiancé in his darkest hour. And this elaborate interview is but a prelude to a massive encounter with Count Dracula, who comes to the convent to reclaim his pet. He shows all the classic powers like controlling bats and wolves, plus a few variations on his abilities. When he transforms from wolf to humanoid, he rips right through the wolf's skin, meaning that he's totally nude and bloody for the rest of his confrontation with the nuns. We also see new abilities, like gaining the knowledge and skills of those he feeds on, and the ability to wear their skin like a disguise. He uses Harker to invite him inside, whereupon he butchers every single nun inside, one of which he beheads with a giant sword, before he finally takes on the appearance of Harker to get close to Mina and Van Helsing, an astonishing cliffhanger that gave me this huge surge of hope for the next 2 episodes. I kind of wish I'd stopped watching then and there, but overall, I loved how Dracula in this show is this giant ham who loves to get attention and to be around people, and that his sudden switch to feeding on intellectuals and aristocrats is fueled by his desire to enhance who he is, almost like a connoisseur in a wine cellar. There's also an interesting scientific side to the vampire lore, well and thoroughly explored through Van Helsing. Perfect example would be how Dracula hates mirrors and crosses, but not for the traditional reasons. He hates mirrors because he sees too deeply into them and sees a reflection that is rotten and decayed. But best of all, Dracula and Van Helsing have this mutual respect and admiration that creates a really interesting rivalry. Rather than kill Van Helsing, Dracula wants to keep her around as long as possible, and that she's the first interesting person he's met in centuries. Had the show been able to sustain this level of quality, I'd be here telling you that this show is a complete and total home run and required viewing. But for reasons I'm about to go into, my unbridled love and enthusiasm slowly ebbed and dwindled over the next 2 episodes. Admittedly, episode 2 was still very solid, but nowhere near as outrageous and fun as the first. Rewritten almost like an Agatha Christie novel, or perhaps even the horror version of the movie Clue, episode 2 is concerned with the voyage of the Demeter, the ship that Dracula takes to the west to where he's bought his new home, Carfax Abbey, in the heart of London. Once again, we have a framing device where Dracula's playing chess with Van Helsing, who he has stowed on board so that he can periodically feed on her. Like Harker, her nails are falling off and she's starting to die. But rather than hide in boxes of earth throughout the entire journey, like in Nosferatu or in Coppola's film, emerging periodically in order to feed, in this show, Dracula wanders about freely. He's kind of a social butterfly and is enjoying the chance to interact with and acquire new skills from all the interesting passengers on board. Slowly but surely, Dracula picks off the guests and crew members one at a time until the remainder, they all join forces and take him on, destroying the boat, leaving Dracula stranded in a coffin underwater, only a few hundred yards from their destination. He emerges in what seems like only minutes, but as we learn at the end of the episode, he slept for 123 years, and that helicopters, mercenaries, and the descendants of Van Helsing, a woman named Zoe, are waiting for him when he arrives. I immediately got a bad feeling that was more or less confirmed in the next episode. And I'll go ahead and say it, but the third episode kind of broke me. Not because of reimagining the tale of Dracula in the modern age, but because it required a massive emotional reset with an almost entirely new cast of characters, classic characters like Jack Seward, Lucy Westenra, Renfield, and Quincy. As we learn, the Harker Foundation has been waiting for Dracula for years and imprisons him in this bunker below ground where they want to try and use his blood to cure the cancer that Zoe suffers from. Dracula opens a vein and lets her drink, which connects her spiritually to her ancestor from the first 2 episodes. The horror ingredients disappear almost entirely this episode in favor of a more meta, media-savvy approach where Dracula shows off his ability to adapt to the modern age. He's blown away by all the modern conveniences in a relatively poor home, one that he describes as offering more comfort and wonders than any palace or castle he's ever seen. After having already seen so many changes from the 15th to the 19th century, he's eager to learn whatever he can, and he's soon Skyping away in his prison cell with his lawyer Renfield, whose firm has been on retainer since 1896, when Dracula bought Carfax Abbey. A lot of this episode is played for laughs, like Dracula's initial confusion over the idea of basic human rights. He refers to democracy as the tyranny of the uninformed, but he's a fast learner, and he quickly subverts the idea of rights when his lawyer Renfield frees him immediately from his cage, calls him master, and helps him begin his quest for world domination. Seeing Mark Gatiss in this role was a lot of fun, even felt disappointed overall. The rest of the episode focuses primarily on Dracula's love affair with Lucy, the first woman to voluntarily open her veins to him in 5 centuries. As he seduces her in a graveyard, they listen to the undead scratching at the lids of their coffins, a sound that Dracula finds delightful, like the howling of the wolves in his homeland. We see that Jack and Quincy are both in love with her, but there's not nearly enough time for either of these characters to become as interesting as they are in the novel. In the book, Jack is an absolutely essential component. They probably should have let this character out entirely. But Lucy's transformation into a vampire goes horribly wrong when her body's cremated at her funeral, meaning that she'll be doomed to be disfigured for all of eternity, except for her reflection, which for now is beautiful. Jack ends her suffering right before the scene that came close to ruining the whole show for me. Zoe explains that Dracula's not really vulnerable to the sun or to crosses, and that he's been clinging to illusions for centuries, all as a way of avoiding the type of heroic death enjoyed by his predecessors. She basically says that he's ashamed of himself and too cowardly to die. Now, I get that the show is enjoying playing with the mythology of vampires, but for me, they bent the lore to the point where the character becomes broken and isn't any fun to follow anymore. So he decides to drink Zoe's cancerous blood so that he can join her in death for all of eternity. And then the episode ends really abruptly, leaving me with this really unsatisfied feeling with how the story drew to a close. I'm not sure if everyone will feel that way, but the ending left me a little ambivalent about the entire show overall. There's no denying that I was completely in love with the first episode, but that intense emotion made this lackluster ending all the worse by comparison. So in my final estimation, I'd have to say this is a very ambitious show, a very creative show with a lot of exciting new ideas, but one that really fails to stick the landing, making it really hard for me to give a vigorous recommendation. That said, the show did give me a lot of laughs and jolts early on, so for that, I applaud the efforts of everyone involved. In any event, I think I'm going to go ahead and draw this review to a close. Hope you enjoyed the review. If you want to talk more about Bram Stoker's book or any of the subsequent movie adaptations, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax or leave me a comment in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, giving the channel a subscribe. That's very helpful to me, but hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.